To understand 1986, you first have to understand the silence that preceded it. By the start of the year, the American media had already written the obituary for the video game industry. The great crash of '83 had wiped out 97% of revenues, leaving retailers like Sears and Kmart with warehouses full of unsold cartridges. The numbers from 1986 tell the story of a resurrection. Just 12 months prior, the entire U.S. home console market was worth a pitiful $100 million. By the time the Christmas wrapping paper was torn off in December 1986, that number had quadrupled to $430 million. And this wasn't an even playing field. Nintendo of America, operating out of a warehouse in Redmond, Washington, captured $310 million of that pie, roughly 70% of the entire market. In a single year, they sold 1.1 million consoles. They didn't just recover the market, they monopolized it. They replaced the word Atari with Nintendo in the American vocabulary. But hardware sales were only half the battle. Nintendo knew that the crash of '83 was caused by a flood of terrible, broken games that destroyed consumer trust. In 1986, they implemented a draconian solution, the official Nintendo Seal of Quality. This gold sticker on the box was more than marketing. It was an iron fist. It meant Nintendo had to approve every single game released on their system. They restricted third-party publishers like Konami and Capcom to releasing only 5 games a year. It was restrictive, it was controlling, and it was brilliant. It told American parents that if they bought a game with that seal, it wouldn't be a waste of money. In 1986, trust was the most valuable currency in gaming. But we can't talk about 1986 without mentioning the gamers who never left. While consoles were being resurrected, millions of Americans had simply migrated to the desk. The Commodore 64 was having a banner year in '86, holding nearly 40% of the personal computer market. For a generation of teenagers, the recovery wasn't about Mario. It was about the Bard's Tale, leaderboard golf, and pirating games on floppy disks. The Commodore 64 kept the flame of gaming culture alive during the dark years, bridging the gap until the consoles could catch up. 1986 wasn't just the year gaming returned to the TV, it was the year the industry split into 2 distinct tribes, the console gamer and the PC gamer.
If 1986 was the year Nintendo saved video games, it was also the year IBM lost control of the computer. For 5 years, IBM and personal computer had been synonyms. If you were a serious business, you bought Big Blue. But in 1986, that reality fractured. For the first time, IBM's share of the very market it created slipped below 50%. The king was no longer the majority ruler of its own kingdom. And it didn't happen because of a single enemy. It happened because of an army. IBM wasn't just fighting one competitor, they were fighting a hydra. By 1986, the Clone Wars had gone nuclear. You had reputable American companies like Tandy and Zenith chipping away at the high end, but the real damage came from below. A flood of no-name Turbo XTs from Taiwan and Korea began hitting American shelves. But the fatal blow in 1986 didn't come from the cheap end of the market. It came from the top. In September, Compaq Computer Corporation did the unthinkable. They released the Deskpro 386. Historically, IBM always led the dance. They released a new machine and everyone else copied it. But Compaq got tired of waiting. They grabbed Intel's powerful new 386 chip and built the world's first 32-bit super PC before IBM did. It was a technological coup. Suddenly, the clone was faster, more powerful, and more advanced than the original. In 1986, IBM went from being the innovator to being the slow-moving dinosaur chasing its own tail. So on September 9th, Compaq unveiled the Deskpro 386. It looked like a standard beige box, but under the hood, it was a Ferrari engine inside a minivan. Running at 16 megahertz, it wasn't just fast, it was alien.
It could perform 4 million operations per second, 3 times faster than IBM's top-of-the-line PCAT. To the average user, it was overkill. To software developers and office users, it was a revelation. It didn't just run spreadsheets, it annihilated them. But this power came with a price tag that made eyes water. The base model started at $6,499. That's about $18,000 in today's money, and yet they couldn't build them fast enough. The release of the Deskpro 386 was more than a product launch, it was a coup. For the first time in history, the most powerful personal computer on Earth did not have an IBM logo on the front. By the time IBM finally stumbled to market with their own 386 machine, nearly a year later, the war was already over. Compaq had proven that the standard no longer belonged to Big Blue. It belonged to whoever was brave enough to use the best technology first. In 1986, the IBM Compatible died, and the industry-standard PC was born. To understand the 80386, you have to look at the microscopic blueprint. Inside that ceramic square, Intel packed 275,000 transistors, more than double what was inside the previous 286 chip. It was manufactured using a 1.5-micron process, a level of miniaturization that was cutting edge for 1985-86. When it launched, it ran at speeds of 16 megahertz, eventually pushing to 20, 25, and 33. But raw speed wasn't the headline. The headline was width. The 80386 was a true 32-bit processor. This meant it had 32-bit internal registers and, crucially, a 32-bit data bus. Think of the 286 as a 2-lane country road. The 386 was an 8-lane superhighway. It could move twice as much data in a single clock cycle as its predecessor. The immediate impact of those 32 bits was memory. The previous generation, the 286, was suffocated by a hard limit. It could only address 16 megabytes of RAM. But in 1986, while that sounded like a lot, there were already computers such as Atari 1040 ST with 1 megabyte of RAM. The 386 shattered that ceiling. Because of its 32-bit address bus, it could theoretically access 4 gigabytes of physical RAM. In 1986, 4 gigabytes of memory would have cost millions of dollars and filled a room, but the architecture was future-proof in a way no consumer chip had ever been before. It also introduced the flat memory model. Programmers no longer had to break their software into tiny, messy 64-kilobyte segments like they did on the old chips. They could finally see the entire memory as one giant continuous pool. But the real genius of the 386 wasn't just raw power, it was the Memory Management Unit, or MMU, built right onto the silicon. This little circuit gave the chip a superpower called paging. Paging allowed the computer to swap chunks of memory to the hard drive seamlessly, creating virtual memory. This meant you could run programs that were larger than your actual RAM chips. And then there was the virtual 80386 mode. This was the killer feature for compatibility. It allowed the 386 to carve out secure, isolated sandboxes that acted like completely separate old-school computers. This is what allowed you to multitask. You could have your Lotus 123 spreadsheet calculating in one window and your word processor in another, and neither program knew the other existed. If one crashed, the whole computer didn't die, just that window closed. This hardware feature laid the physical foundation for modern operating systems like Windows 95, OS/2, and Linux. Technically, the 386 was so advanced that software wouldn't catch up to it for nearly a decade. In 1986, it was a race car stuck in a traffic jam of old 16-bit DOS software. But by defining the x86-32 instruction set, also called IA32, this chip didn't just win 1986, it won the next 20 years. Every major PC processor that followed, the 486, the Pentium, the Core series, was essentially just a faster, more optimized version of the blueprint Intel drew in 1986.
Also released in the same year, despite the nostalgia, the Apple IIGS was effectively a gold-plated tombstone.
Released in late 1986, it was a confused machine, a 16-bit shell shackled to an ancient 8-bit architecture. While the Commodore Amiga and Atari ST were offering true multitasking power for half the price, the 2GS was laughably overpriced and intentionally crippled. Apple executives, terrified of hurting the Macintosh, artificially capped its speed at a snail-like 2.8 megahertz. It wasn't a revolution, it was a cynical cash grab designed to milk school budgets one last time before the Apple II was taken out back and shot. In 1986, while Nintendo was conquering the living room and Compaq was rewriting the rules of the PC, a small Canadian company named ATI, Array Technology Inc., quietly solved the biggest headache in computer graphics. At the time, buying a graphics card was a gamble. You had to choose between sharp text with an MDA card, grainy colors with a CGA card, or high-resolution monochrome with a Hercules card. If you brought the wrong monitor or wanted to run software that didn't support your specific card, you were out of luck. The industry was fractured and consumers were paying the price. ATI's answer to this chaos was a product initially called the Graphics Solution, which would soon evolve into the famous Wonder series. Released in 1986, this card was a technological Swiss Army knife. It combined the circuitry of all the major competing standards onto a single board. For the first time, a user didn't need to know the difference between TTL monochrome and RGB color. They just plugged the card in and it worked. It could display CGA color graphics on a monochrome monitor using shades of gray, or run high-resolution Hercules text on a color screen, feats that were previously impossible. This all-in-one philosophy was revolutionary because it decoupled the software from the hardware. In late 1986, ATI doubled down on this concept by preparing the EGA Wonder, a card that would officially hit shelves in early 1987, but was engineered during this pivotal year. The Wonder series didn't just offer better graphics, it offered peace of mind. It effectively ended the format wars for the average consumer and established ATI as the company that championed compatibility over exclusivity, a reputation that would eventually make them a titan in the 3D era decades later.
To truly understand the weight of 1986, we can look to Masahiro Sakurai, the legendary creator of Super Smash Bros. And Kirby. In 2024, after decades of developing games and studying the industry's history, Sakurai released a video essay with the definitive conclusion: 1986 was the greatest year in video game history. He calls it the year of legend. In his analysis, he points out that it is almost statistically impossible for one single year to birth so many genre-defining pillars at once. He lists them off like a roll call of royalty: The Legend of Zelda, Dragon Quest, Metroid, Castlevania, and Kid Icarus. Sakurai argues that this was the year the medium grew up. It was the moment where technology finally caught up to imagination. The introduction of the megabit cartridge and the Famicom disk system allowed developers to stop making simple single-screen loops and start building worlds. He notes that without the hardware leaps of 1986, the expansive nature of modern gaming simply wouldn't exist. For Sakurai, 1986 wasn't just a good year on the calendar, it was the Big Bang that created the universe we are still playing in today.
Released in February 1986 alongside the Famicom disk system, The Legend of Zelda was a radical departure from the arcade sensibilities that had defined the previous decade. Shigeru Miyamoto and Takashi Tezuka designed the game as a direct antithesis to Super Mario Bros. Where Mario was linear and athletic, Zelda was non-linear and cerebral. Miyamoto drew inspiration from his childhood in Sonobe, Japan, exploring forests, caves, and hillsides without a map, discovering hidden lakes and secrets on his own terms. He wanted to translate that feeling of miniature gardening, a sense of cultivating a world and discovering its secrets, into a digital format.
The game dropped the player into the land of Hyrule with no instructions, a wooden sword, and total freedom. You could walk in any direction, stumble into dungeons you weren't ready for, and uncover secrets that required genuine problem-solving rather than twitch reflexes. The technical innovation of 1986 was just as important as the design. Because the Famicom disk system utilized rewritable media, and later the cartridge version used a battery-backed RAM chip, The Legend of Zelda became the first console game where players could save their progress. This was a monumental shift in how games were consumed. It allowed for a massive, sprawling world that didn't need to be beaten in a single sitting. This long-form gameplay gave birth to the action-adventure genre. The game also featured a second quest, a remixed, harder version of the game unlocked after beating it. A feature included simply because the developers had used only half the memory space and wanted to fill the disk. Zelda proved that video games could be epic journeys, not just quarter-munching diversions.
Released in September 1986 by Konami, Castlevania, known in Japan as Akumajo Dracula, brought a mature, cinematic gravity to the Famicom that had rarely been seen before. While most platformers of the era were trying to copy the slippery, momentum-based physics of Super Mario Bros., Castlevania went in the opposite direction. The protagonist, Simon Belmont, moved with a deliberate, heavy stiffness. He walked slowly, and once a player committed to a jump, they could not change direction in midair. This commitment mechanic turned every enemy encounter and platforming gap into a tactical decision rather than a test of speed. The whip mechanism also introduced a delay, requiring players to anticipate enemy movements rather than simply reacting to them. This design philosophy created a game that was punishingly difficult but fair, rewarding mastery and pattern recognition over luck. Aesthetically, the game was a love letter to the classic universal horror films of the 1930s and 40s. The game was structured as a gauntlet through Dracula's castle, pitting the player against pop culture icons like the Mummy, Frankenstein's monster, the Grim Reaper, and Medusa. This B-movie atmosphere was elevated by what many historians consider one of the greatest soundtracks of the 8-bit era. Composed by the Konami Kukeiha Club, the music used the Famicom's limited sound channels to create complex, driving rock tracks that mimicked progressive rock and gothic organ music. Tracks like Vampire Killer provided an intense, driving energy that contrasted with the spooky visuals. Castlevania proved that the kiddie Nintendo console could handle dark themes, gothic art styles, and sophisticated musical composition, laying the groundwork for the rise of mature gaming.
In May 1986, Enix released Dragon Quest, a title that arguably had a greater cultural impact on Japan than any other piece of software in history. Before this game, role-playing games were complex, inaccessible affairs found mostly on Western personal computers like Ultima and Wizardry. They required keyboards, reading thick manuals, and understanding complex mathematics. Designer Yuji Horii wanted to democratize this experience. He streamlined the RPG into a menu-based system that could be played with just a D-pad and 2 buttons. To make the package appealing to the masses, he assembled a dream team of talent. The art was designed by Akira Toriyama, the creator of Dragon Ball, and the score was composed by classical musician Koichi Sugiyama. This trinity of talent created a game that felt like a playable anime, accessible to children but deep enough for adults. The game's structure was revolutionary for consoles. It introduced the concept of the overworld map, random battles, experience points, and a narrative that unfolded over dozens of hours. It established the vocabulary of the JRPG, talking to townspeople to gather clues, upgrading armor in shops, and delving into dungeons to retrieve key items. The release was a phenomenon. Famously, the game became so addictive that the Japanese urban legends persist to this day that the government had to pass a law banning Enix from releasing Dragon Quest games on weekdays because too many students and salarymen were skipping school and work to buy it.
While the law is a myth, the social disruption was real. Dragon Quest didn't just create a genre, it shifted the center of gravity for RPG development from the United States to Japan for the next 2 decades.
Released in August 1986, Metroid was the dark sci-fi cousin to Nintendo's family-friendly lineup. Produced by Gunpei Yokoi and the R&D1 team, the game was heavily influenced by Ridley Scott's film Alien. It traded the bright blue skies of the Mushroom Kingdom for the oppressive black backgrounds and claustrophobic corridors of the planet Zebes. Unlike other games that encouraged constant forward momentum, Metroid was a game about barriers. The player controlled Samus Aran, a bounty hunter who started the game weak and unable to progress past certain obstacles. The core gameplay loop involved exploring, finding a power-up like the morph ball or missiles, and then backtracking to a previous area to unlock a new path. This design structure, now known as Metroidvania, turned the map itself into a giant puzzle box that the player had to solve. The atmosphere of Metroid was uniquely isolating. The music, composed by Hirokazu Tanaka, eschewed catchy melodies for dissonant, atmospheric bleeps and hums that made the player feel truly alone on a hostile world. But the game's most famous contribution to history was its ending. If the player completed the game in under a certain time, Samus would remove her power suit, revealing that the badass, heavily armed protagonist was a woman. In 1986, an era dominated by muscle-bound male action heroes, this was a genuine shock to the system. It challenged gender norms in gaming and established Samus Aran as the first lady of video games. Metroid proved that 8-bit games could evoke feelings of dread, isolation, and mystery, expanding the emotional palette of the medium. Released in December 1986, Kid Icarus is often viewed as the eccentric sibling to Metroid. Both games were developed by the same division, used the same game engine, and shared a password system. However, where Metroid focused on exploration, Kid Icarus focused on vertical peril. The game was loosely based on Greek mythology, starring the angel Pit on a quest to save the goddess Palutena. The first third of the game was a grueling vertical climb out of the underworld. If the player scrolled the screen up, the platforms below disappeared. Falling meant instant death. This unforgiving difficulty curve earned the game a reputation as one of the hardest titles in the NES library. The game was also notable for its bizarre sense of humor, featuring enemies like the Eggplant Wizard, who could turn the player into a walking vegetable, rendering them unable to attack. Despite its difficulty, Kid Icarus was innovative in how it blended genres. It wasn't just a platformer, it incorporated light RPG elements. Pit collected hearts from defeated enemies, which acted as currency to buy items in shops or bribe the gods for strength upgrades. The game also changed perspective, shifting from vertical platforming to horizontal scrolling, and finally to a side-scrolling shooter mechanic for the final boss fight against Medusa. While it didn't achieve the same commercial smash hit status as Zelda or Mario, Kid Icarus garnered a dedicated cult following. It stands as a testament to Nintendo's willingness in 1986 to experiment with genre mashing, combining platforming, shooting, and RPG mechanics into a strange, challenging package.
While home consoles were exploring depth and duration, the arcade scene of 1986 was mastering the art of spectacle, and Sega's Outrun was the crown jewel. Designed by the visionary Yu Suzuki, Outrun was not a racing game, it was a driving game. Suzuki famously stated that he wanted to capture the feeling of driving a luxury car across the European coast with a beautiful passenger, prioritizing the experience of the journey over the stress of competition. The game utilized Sega's proprietary superscalar technology, which allowed thousands of 2D sprites to scale smoothly in and out of the screen.
This created a fluid pseudo-3D effect that was blistering fast and visually stunning, simulating hills, curves, and dips in the road with a realism that no home console could hope to match. The arcade cabinet itself was a major part of the allure. The deluxe version was a sit-down hydraulic beast that physically banked and shook in sync with the steering wheel, immersing the player in the G-forces of the drive. Musically, Outrun was groundbreaking. It was one of the first games to let the player choose their own soundtrack via an in-game radio dial, featuring iconic laid-back jazz fusion tracks like Magical Sound Shower and Splash Wave. The game also featured a non-linear structure with branching paths. At the end of each stage, the road split, allowing players to choose their own route through different environments, from deserts to vineyards, leading to 5 different endings. Outrun defined the blue sky aesthetic of Sega and remains a symbol of 80s optimism and cool.
Taito's Bobble, released to arcades in 1986, was a masterclass in cooperative game design. In an era dominated by military shooters and aggressive martial arts games, Bobble was unapologetically cute. Players controlled Bub and Bob, 2 dragons who could blow bubbles to trap enemies. Once trapped, the player had to pop the bubble with their spines to defeat the foe, turning them into fruit for points. Beneath this simple, sugary exterior lay a game of immense depth. There were 100 levels, a staggering amount for an arcade game, and the mechanics for bubble movement, riding bubbles to reach high platforms, and chaining enemy kills were surprisingly complex. It became a favorite among power gamers who competed for high scores by memorizing the complex spawning algorithms of items. However, the game's true legacy is its focus on friendship. Bobble is widely considered one of the first games to truly enforce cooperative play. While you could play it alone, the game subtly punished you for it. The true ending of the game was locked behind a requirement to clear all 100 levels with 2 players alive. If a solo player reached the final boss, the game would display a message telling them to come here with your friend and loop them back to previous levels. This social engineering made the cabinet a massive hit in arcades as it forced players to recruit partners. Coupled with one of the most infectious, looping earworm soundtracks in gaming history, Bobble proved that soft, cooperative gameplay could be just as profitable as violent competition.
The game known today as The Lost Levels is perhaps the most fascinating failure of 1986. Released in Japan on the Famicom Disk System simply as Super Mario Bros. 2, it was designed by Miyamoto as a challenge to the players who had mastered the original 1985 game. It looked almost identical to the first game, but featured a difficulty curve that bordered on sadistic. It introduced poison mushrooms that looked like power-ups but would kill or shrink the player, gusts of wind that blew Mario off ledges, and jumps that required pixel-perfect precision on a specific frame. It was a game designed for the hardcore elite, effectively the first Kaizo Mario game, punishing the player for trusting the mechanics they had learned a year prior. The historical significance of this game lies in its rejection. When Howard Lincoln, the head of Nintendo of America, tested the game, he was horrified. He believed the game was unfairly difficult and visually too similar to the first game, fearing it would alienate American children and crash the recovering U.S. market. He famously told the Japanese headquarters that the game would not be released in North America. This decision forced Nintendo to scramble for a replacement sequel for the US, eventually leading them to take a completely unrelated Arabian-themed game called Yume Kojo Doki Doki Panic, replace the characters with Mario sprites, and release that as Super Mario Bros. 2 in the West. The original 1986 Super Mario Bros. 2 remained a Japanese exclusive for years, a testament to the diverging philosophies of the Eastern and Western gaming markets in the mid-80s.
Released in September 1986 for the NES,
Adventure Island is a game defined by its frantic pace and its famous mascot. While it was developed by Hudson Soft, the game is actually a licensed, reskinned port of the arcade game Wonder Boy, discussed below. Hudson replaced the original protagonist with Master Higgins, a caricature of their real-life spokesman, Takahashi Meijin. In Japan, Takahashi was a genuine celebrity known for his ability to press a controller button 16 times per second. Adventure Island capitalized on his fame, becoming one of the defining platformers of the NES era. The gameplay was distinct from Mario due to its stamina mechanic. Higgins had a health bar that constantly depleted over time, forcing the player to frantically collect fruit to stay alive. This ticking clock mechanic fundamentally changed how the game was played. You couldn't stop to admire the view or carefully plan jumps. You had to keep moving. The game also introduced the skateboard power-up, which increased speed but removed the ability to stop, turning levels into high-speed reflex tests. Adventure Island is notorious for its steep difficulty curve, particularly in the later worlds, where enemy placement became borderline unfair. Despite the difficulty, the bright, tropical aesthetic and the catchy music made it a massive hit. It stands as a prime example of the mascot platformer era, where a company's brand identity was just as important as the software itself. SNK's Ikari Warriors, released to arcades in 1986, was the definitive run-and-gun shooter of the era. Heavily inspired by the movie Rambo: First Blood Part 2, the game featured two muscle-bound soldiers, Ralph and Clark, who would later become staples of the King of Fighters series, storming through a jungle to topple a dictatorship. The game is historically significant for its unique control scheme, the rotary joystick. This stick could be pushed in 8 directions to move, but the handle itself could be twisted to rotate the character's torso. This allowed players to run in one direction while shooting in another, a mechanic that added a layer of tactical depth and strafing capability unseen in other shooters. The game was also a pioneer of cooperative chaos. It was designed to be played with a friend, and the sheer volume of bullets, tanks, and explosions on screen was designed to drain quarters at a rapid pace. Players could hijack enemy tanks and helicopters, adding a vehicle combat element that empowered the player briefly before the vehicle inevitably exploded. While the NES port was famously clunky and slow, the arcade original was a visceral, loud, and aggressive experience that perfectly captured the 1980s obsession with the one-man army action hero. It solidified SNK's reputation for creating high-octane, arcade-perfect action games.
Developed by Westone, originally Escape, and released by Sega in arcades in 1986, Wonder Boy is the genetic father of Adventure Island. The game starred Tom Tom, a tribal boy trying to rescue his girlfriend Tina. If the gameplay sounds familiar, throwing stone axes, riding skateboards, and collecting fruit to replenish a depleting vitality bar, it's because Hudson Soft licensed this exact game to create Adventure Island. However, the original arcade version of Wonder Boy is often cited as the superior technical experience, featuring more detailed sprites and smoother scrolling than its NES clone. It was a game of momentum. The character had a slippery feel that required players to master the physics of inertia, especially when dashing. Wonder Boy is historically important because it spawned one of the most confusing franchises in gaming. While the first game was a pure linear platformer, its sequels, beginning with Wonder Boy in Monsterland, would pivot to become action RPGs with swords, shields, and shops. This makes the original 1986 Wonder Boy a unique outlier in its own series. It was a pure arcade endurance test, famous for its hidden dolls that players had to collect to unlock the true ending.
Its bright, colorful visuals masked a brutal difficulty that demanded perfection, influencing the design of speed-focused platformers for years to come. Sierra Online's King's Quest III, released in October 1986, was a bold narrative risk for designer Roberta Williams. Instead of playing as the beloved King Graham, players controlled Gwydion, a lowly slave boy trapped in the house of the evil wizard Manannan. The game introduced a real-time clock mechanic that created immense tension. The wizard would leave the house for specific intervals, and the player had to frantically explore, gather ingredients, and cast spells before he returned. If you were caught out of your room or holding a forbidden item when the clock struck, you were instantly killed. This mechanics-driven storytelling was a massive leap forward for the adventure genre. The game is also famous for its brutal copy protection. To cast magic spells, players had to type out long, complex incantations exactly as they appeared in the physical game manual. If you pirated the game and didn't have the book, you couldn't progress. The spellcasting system was unforgiving but immersive, making the player feel like they were actually learning magic. While critics at the time were initially confused by the shift away from King Graham, the emotional payoff, discovering Gwydion's true identity as the lost Prince Alexander, set a new standard for storytelling in computer games. It proved that sequels didn't just have to offer more of the same. While King's Quest took itself seriously, Space Quest arrived in October 1986 to poke fun at everything. Created by the two guys from Andromeda, Scott Murphy and Mark Crow, the game introduced Roger Wilco, a cosmic janitor who would rather be napping in a closet than saving the universe. This was the anti-hero the industry needed. Space Quest was a parody of Star Wars, Star Trek, and pop culture, filled with sarcasm and breaking the fourth wall. It shifted the tone of adventure games from high fantasy to lowbrow comedy. The game was difficult, but unlike King's Quest, the deaths were designed to be funny, encouraging players to fail just to see the gag. Mechanically, it used Sierra's AGI engine, typing commands to interact, but it added arcade-style minigames like riding a skimmer across a desert, which frustrated many adventure purists. However, the game's charm lay in its everyman protagonist. Roger Wilco wasn't a chosen one, he was just a guy in the wrong place at the wrong time. Space Quest proved that comedy was a viable genre for video games. It garnered a massive cult following and allowed Sierra to dominate the PC market by offering two distinct flavors, the serious drama of King's Quest and the slapstick sci-fi of Space Quest. In 1986, a young developer named John Van Caneghem released Might and Magic Book 1 out of his apartment, launching New World Computing. While Ultima and Wizardry were the titans of the RPG world, Might and Magic carved out its own space by combining the first-person dungeon crawling of Wizardry with the vast open-world exploration of Ultima. The game was massive. It featured over 50 explorable areas, including outdoor forests, mountains, and castles, all mapped on a grid system. It was one of the first RPGs to feature a seamless world, where you could walk out of a town and directly into the wilderness without a loading screen or perspective change. The game was unapologetically technical and difficult. Players controlled a party of 6 adventurers, managing race, class, and alignment, which affected how NPCs reacted to you. It was famous for its sheer scale and the cryptic nature of its quests, which eventually blended standard fantasy tropes with science fiction elements, a twist that would become a hallmark of the series. Might and Magic was a triumph of indie development in 1986, proving that a single dedicated creator could build a world that rivaled the biggest commercial releases. It laid the foundation for a franchise that would dominate the Western RPG market for the next decade. In retrospect, 1986 was more than just a recovery, it was a renaissance. It was the year the industry stopped trying to merely replicate the arcade and started building worlds. Whether it was the battery backup of Zelda allowing us to save our progress, the raw power of the Compaq 386 defining the modern PC, or the atmospheric storytelling of Metroid, this was the moment the medium found its soul. We often focus on the crash of 1983, but we rarely celebrate the big bang that followed just 3 years later. The franchises born in these 12 months, from Dragon Quest to Castlevania, are not just history, they are the pillars that still hold up the industry today. 1986 didn't just save video games, it defined them forever.